Someone just recently asked me such a delightful philosophical question that allowed me to synthesize a lot of things that I've been thinking about recently. And anyway, so I'm just going to actually read my response to the question and read out the question, which I must say I don't fully understand exactly potentially what is being referred to in the question, because these are just labels which are used, which I mean, I have my own definition of what these labels mean, but you can never presume what other people uh, have in those references. So, uh, anyways, the title of this recording will be probably Occam's razor or Occam's razors, plural, and dead players, which is basically the two concepts that I'm trying to link together. So she asked me, do you believe that Occam's razor would affirm to Platonism or nominalism? I've been debating this in my head, but I want to know your thoughts. And this really is an ingenious question. I mean, it has so many, it's just because Occam's razor, as I explore, is well, this is towards the end of the synthesis, essentially. Occam's razor is a very good um, catch all for what people do in terms of their narrative projection, in terms of their reality tunnel, in terms of their sort of external locus of control, sort of scapegoating, all those things, or reactive. Sort of relenting into an external locus of control. But anyway, I'm really preempting the actual induction into this. So let me just so I don't understand that train of thought. What is nominalism? But Occam's razor is also just a heuristic. It's an antithetical. Oh, sorry, it's antithetical to Platonic metaphysics. So if it's rejected by Platonism, what's the point of using it to end up at Platonism? Sorry, if Occam's razor is rejected by Platonism, what's the point of using Occam's razor to end up at Platonism? I don't think Occam's razor is applicable in the field of higher order orientation and metaphysics, because those kinds of questions already infer commitments or refutations to notional apparatus like Occam's razor. Occam's razor is not even self supporting, it's an idolatry. It's useful for problems that need mechanical or amoral or morally neutral implication. Sorry, that grammar is weak. Or morally neutral. Can't think of a good word. Attenuation, um, or involvement. Anyway, dead player mechanics. To use it with any authority over selecting what worldview to pick uh, is not a useless case to philosophically probe. So I'm trying to say that it's a really bountiful question to interrogate in one's mind. But I believe the conclusion is that it is the wrong metric because it has no rationale from which to render value judgment. It's not even a rationality test, it's literally an associative metaphor. It says if it's not like or endorsed by Occam's razor, you're probably wasting your time believing something. Uh, as a heuristic, it's useful, but it commits you to a utilitarian value schema, and in some sense is deeply connected to scientism and the confused conflation between rationality and something being correct or true, which is a hideously unreasonable connection that gets you by in a world of false authority that expects rationality with its covert narratives to be observed blindly, and which it then passes off as morally good enough by mere token of some pretense about its rational self-consistency, uh, uh, i.e., it doesn't explain or substantiate or defend its value claims. It's totally incoherent. But it claims to be sort of a successful pattern, so it should just be slavishly sort of mimicked. it is really worth being insensitive to the proposition. Sorry, I was asking this as a rhetorical question, I guess. Is it really worth being insensitive to the proposition that Platonism can't endorse Occam's razor, and labeling Occam's razor as leading to choose Platonism over nominalism? I guess I'm trying to get to the point that that it becomes a sort of a useless endeavor um, to even work out which Occam's razor would elect. Um, in some sense, Occam's razor should translate itself before being used to choose between Platonism and nominalism, perhaps into the notion that each psychological schema portended by each should each be emulated directly and then qualitatively in a holistic package, then be compared. But at that point, you flipped Occam's razor into a very vague and nebulous heuristic, which I would argue is necessary when dealing with these higher order questions or grounding value, which supersede Occam's razor, in which you have to placate or contend with many mysteries simultaneously. To work out which schema is simpler at solving the mysteries that are required to have a coherent and functional schema. To simply have a simpler schema or demand a simplex when you throw out corrigible functionality, but you might need to juxtaposed against the need that you might uh, uh, sorry, I'm trying to make a general claim that there might be needs to bootstrap and demand some facet of justifiable incorrigibility, in some sense, a naked use of axiom that will involve special or peculiar applications of epistemological accountability, that Occam's razor has no sensitivity with, other than to side with the schema that appears less spooky, but at the cost of being too simple and throwing the baby out with the bathwater and being holistically self-consistent when doing so. So it can be rational as it essentially becomes a kind of unconscious nihilism, perhaps, but essentially because it has no values other than using this metric, which is a mere heuristic. In the end, there is no mere rational election to be made that can be counted as respectable. It's a choice, which includes choosing to be empowered slash enthralled from the value, inverted commas, latent in Occam's razor. So I'm trying to play devil's advocate and saying that, well, you're either enthralled by it or you can describe yourself as being empowered by it. Therefore, I think in any reasonable sense, Occam's razor excludes itself, and therefore and thereby excludes the nominal selection that it indicates as being on the face of it suboptimal and uh, uh, what I guess, sorry, I didn't put the grammar in here. Selection that indicates as being on the face of it that Occam's razor is suboptimal and well, this grammar is really sparse. Razor excludes itself and therefore and thereby excludes the nominal selection that it would indicate, um, which you could, I think, validly sort of label to Occam's razor that it is a kind of suboptimal and utility table thumping, seeking to make authority from a kind of suboptimal set of ingredients or something like that. But when we choose to reject nominalism based on, uh, but then uh, and then I guess what I was saying, but then we should continue and look at nominalism afresh, independently, and reject it based on an independent substantiation and an independent reasoning from the whole Occam's razor sort of lens, uh, which at the same time vilifies Occam's razor because Occam's razor can't do that to itself, although it might be used to collapse itself into dubiousness, as I tried to which I think I've basically gone through the reasoning thereof earlier. So that Occam's razor does, in some sense, if you want to translate it for the thing that you're trying to apply it to, you can kind of get a translation that at least it collapses itself into dubiousness. Or in some sense, you have to collapse it into a mystery before you can use it as part of the solution to this problem. And in some sense, the mystery that it represents, I've tried to argue, is a bit of a paradox, and therefore it's a model of how not to be trapped by a kind of a rational, tautological sort of heuristical substitution of actual choice of values, which in some sense obscures the choice. But sorry, let me just move on. So as a mystery, it's being insensitive to mystery. Therefore, I believe can be said to fail. That it can be said to fail Occam's razor then after that sort of translation into mystery. But it can't qualitatively choose which mysteries are germane. Sorry, I think I've slightly lost my thread, or at least in my expression of grammar, that I had a cogent train of thought, but I didn't express it that well. But it can't qualitatively choose which mysteries are germane to an actually valid epistemology. It's a dead tool, used by those who will become the same who confuse it with a value that contends with a contest of values. I'm trying to describe the paradox. Disguising the experience of an arena with the rules that the arena should do involve. Okay, that I need to clean that up. Occam's razor can't be sensitive to that distinction, or any possible important distinction, because it doesn't judge or draw distinctions within its ambit. It's one tool, and it can get away with itself only by critiquing others for using incorrect tools. It requires negative projections of value denigration in order to stabilize itself. It's a narrative inception and reality tunnel. It's like an associative virus that can only confirm that which agrees back to itself. Because it's not an end, it's a means. And in some sense, it's an end that, in some sense, expects the agent to convert its purpose into a utilitarian, sort of amoral atmosphere before it can even be employed as well. This is why I describe it as a kind of as a dead player, sort of mechanics and sort of field of machination. Okay, and then I get into a personal example here. So this is why ENTPs are so often amoral. For instance, Nathan Gloss banned me because of Occam's razor heuristics, because he doesn't have the time to consider issues, and people seeming to challenge his decisions or authority are unhelpful to his brazen narcissistic value schema and worldview, which is a form of nominalism. If I understand the term you use correctly, it's therefore locked into a latent solipsism, at least on the level of contending values. It might be gated a moralism. It might be gated a moralism that is a useful alarm system, but if it's the core modus operandi, it's part of a selective compartmentalization predicated on disintegration, or invested in its own fundamental sort of disintegration, or at least perpetuated non-integration. I would argue it's better to ethically reject nominalism for ethical grounds and then still use it under very stringent delimitations, and be keenly aware when the ambit of neutral amorality is being exceeded, so that higher order reasoning comes online to become aired. or at least does not make commitments or incorrigible positions against higher order meta-rationality. For example, narrative tunneling that is definitionally predicated on undermining self-determinism or active responsibility, or choosing to endorse purposes which are frivolous and superficial by the scope of their misapplication of truthfulness, seriousness, or carefulness, which may in contextual circumstances be relatively justified, but the quality of combinational efficacy is a reflection of character, which is also, at least in my worldview, a manifestation of one's quality of fate. This is a shareable form of fatalism that can be used to connect and ground the circumvention of solipsism. So, in some sense, I believe that it's only ethics that allow us essentially to share reality, and to even have an agreement that is capable of allowing for something like co-creation and coexistence that has a thread of integrity um, as part of its makeup, I guess. But sorry, I don't want to get too poetical about that. But basically, this is why ENTPs are so prone to toxicity. They latch into, I should have said onto, but into actually also works. They latch into moral narratives. They plug in TI translation of values, and they project onto other people's TE. And they have even and they even have a corrupted world of false authority to validate and be complicit in feeding them this style of moral ambiguous narrative gainsaying. And they can do this to feign rational self-consistency as a marker of coherence. When I said that they can do this, I mean, I guess that they can follow that pattern and feign rational self-consistency as a marker of coherence, but it's not true coherence. It's just saying, oh, I've got the same pattern as other people, and that's good enough. It's an external locus of sort of excuse making. It's a form of scapegoating. I think trying to get to Platonism from Occam's razor is just trying to find a way for you to contend against these types of clowns and their pretentiousness, but they are using an argument that can't actually be resolved. It's a self-consistent election of choice that disguises that election by narrative conditioning and the metaphysical sufficiency or self-assurance of such, uh, of its narrative conditioning is self-assured as being sufficient. At some point, you just have to witness and hear that election within them and mark them as dead players. You can offer and invite them to try another worldview, but you can't win the argument. That's not possible. It's a choice to hear values. It's a choice to give an ear and to give a real hearing to values. And in some sense, they have merely given an ear to non-values, and not be vulnerable or commanded by anti-values. So, in some sense, every choice will be a two-edged sword. So you have your choice to hear your values, and then you won't be vulnerable or commanded by those anti-values. I would say that's arguable that if you are doing so badly, then you probably will have a kind of fatalism which will be woven into your tantric style of your utilization of values. Anyway, I kind of get onto that a bit more. Obviously, compliance by some descriptions is not the same as actual vulnerability. So I'm trying to make a distinction between ostensible descriptive layers of it's famously said in the Gita that you have to be able to see action within inaction and inaction within action as part of sort of discerning, basically. But essentially, real discerning gets you away from layers of descriptive mass which other people might proffer, because the question is, do you value it? Is it endorsed by your values? Are you open to invigilation? Are you capable of really permitting a kind of two-way flow on those sorts of in some sense making your internal locus of control vulnerable. I would say this is the greatest kind of strength in this sense. Obviously not necessarily stupidly or without some kind of purpose attached to it. Sorry, I'm really anticipating this topic too much. Obviously, compliances by some description is not the same as actual vulnerability. Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Follow Caesar's rules when you are in the world. You can never have worldly associates who might be friends of your excuse me, I said that in the negative when it's not written here. I was misspeaking. You can even have worldly associates who might be friends of your narrative, but are they friends in shared values or capable of knowledge of such? Do they have appreciation or capability to appreciate justice or justifications? This is a qualitative mystery, the mystery of grounding values in a possible sea of derision, to witness how the sea is being churned by certain basic concepts, self-determinism, active responsibility, and coherent knowledge claims that entreat those core basic concepts. Just want to say I was sort of inspired to use that sea metaphor from the triadic heart of I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce the name, Siva, maybe, Siva, which is, as far as I can tell, it's called non-dualism, non-dualistic Kashmiri Shiavism, which, as far as I can tell, when I read that book, it's describing elements of it which I see indistinguishable from my understanding of of the Christian doctrine that I understand. Which is, in some sense, I think it has some details which aren't in the Book of Revelations, perhaps, which at the very least I found very correspondent with my models. But I mean, I actually, in some sense, there's more detail in Revelations. And more precision, but the outlines are less descriptive as they are described in this book. But anyway, that's not that important. The use of extroverted intuition to bastardize life or reality outside of those basic concepts, the basic concepts of those three, of self-determinism, active responsibility, and coherent knowledge claims that entreat those other two basic concepts. That is a kind of sort of, at least in social dynamics between individuals, those are the three concepts which each internal locus of control is in some state thereof, which is in some sense creating the sea. And in some sense, people will often print themselves according to the current cultural standard and norm, generally speaking. And obviously, culture has gotten tremendously more degenerated, I would say, especially because of identity politics. I mean, if you the amount of essentially, I think because identity politics has effectively normalized secondary psychopathy, under that guise, there is a kind of there's a masculine kind of narcissism, which is particularly entreated and which is almost a mirror reflection of that, what is generally, archetypally at least, regarded as secondary psychopathy is essentially, if you want a stereotype, it's basically borderline personality disorder. and then there are, let's say, weird hybrid variants now which exist because of political ideology, predominantly identity politics. Um, okay, so anyway, uh, again, when I'm talking about extroverted intuition, I mean I'm making essentially a reference to the ENTP stereotype, or model of personality. The use of extroverted intuition to bastardize life and reality outside of those basic concepts, reductionism for the sake of utilitarian sweetness, masquerading as a highest priority until someone can come and bully it around so that it can accuse that contender that it's just another variant of the same narrative inception circus. And then, so you see, it's a. It just circles back around to its self sufficiency on narrative conditioning. Um, or the kind of, and so I mean, in some sense this is resolved quite simply, is that you have, again, you make a distinction between, let's say, ordinary social norms and the world and social expectations of your wider society, and then, let's say, a private sanctum or sanctuary or space in which you're actually interested in phenomenological self-inquiry, and you're actually, seeking something, perhaps to forge something that has more space for internal integration. And when you are seeking, uh, I mean, there is a kind of, in some sense, I mean, a lot of these things are lost because the mystery traditions, well, are by their nature, well, not necessarily, but I mean, they generally are secret. But essentially, in the mystery traditions, if you know that you're a neophyte, if you, or if that you're a candidate neophyte, or in some sense the neophyte really is, it's hard to, um, I mean, there is this. I mean, even when someone is a neophyte, they are still, in some sense, also a candidate neophyte to some extent, um, until they kind of have enough. But essentially, the recognition that oneself is a neophyte is needed, and then you realize that when you're coming across someone who's got something to say, and they are not a neophyte, perhaps they claim to be an esotericist, and they are speaking to you in a kind of mesoteric pedagogical line of dialogue or conversation, uh, then you should perhaps switch off the dead player mechanics or the dead player heuristics or the dead player tools. And obviously, I'm not saying go be adopted by a cult leader, but take the proposition, uh, as what it is, and in some sense, well, are you a candidate neophyte? And I'm not saying be conditioned by, well, uh, realize that you have to be adopted by something. I mean, I do think that in some sense you do have to have a kind of solid enough Taoistic self practice so that you're capable of knowing when you're being entreated by something that is, appears to have some layers of coherence, but be, I guess, humble enough that, well, if you don't claim to have an integrated internal locus of control, then what is the, in some sense, what is the point of table thumping dead player heuristics? I mean, this is just kind of sort of a profane, um, but this is what ENTPs in fact love to do. In fact, they actually, um, they like experiencing it. Even it's quite sadistic. Um, but in some sense, they are also, I would say, I mean, ENTPs in some sense, I think, get what's the word? Uh, they can get almost magnetically charged by ideology and culture because of their sort of rationality, um, sort of imprint imprinting upon their rationality, upon their TI definitional matrix, a um, a moral narrative. And in some sense, in a what I would describe, obviously this is not the Keegan stages because I disagree with how Keegan defines Keegan stage 4 and Keegan stage 5, or at least how it's been um, communicated to me from secondhand sources. That I mean, I can actually some of the names some of the wordings I could agree with if radically recontextualized. But essentially that Keegan stage 4 is systematicity and Keegan stage 5 is sort of meta fluidity and meta systematicity. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess I do. I guess my model is just much more complicated, but and in some sense, I see very clearly that there are distinct stages. Um, or phases of self actualization, which are quite frankly depicted in Revelations, which is why it seems that the same thing happens and then the same thing happens again because it's happening in a different quadrant. It's happening in a different sort of section of the Keegan stages to some extent. Um, Although again, my model is much more sort of intricate and delicate about the elements within each Keegan stage of development, which in some sense I do need to make my own model, but which is quite frankly what MBTI Four Sides of the Mind was an earlier sort of rendition thereof. But the problem with MBTI is just that the functions are literally in the wrong place. And so you end up with a very sort of fudged approximate system that certainly, I mean, even in its approximateness, the structure of it is so marvelous, should I say, that people forgive it. It's inapproximate, sort of in it. But my model, I think, is much more personable in that an individual. I can't say this too broadly, but an individual that is capable of retaining definitions of cognitive functions would be able to use my model, I think, to do self work at a level that would be essentially, quite frankly, like on another planet. Sort of. Anyway, and in some sense, I do think that it would be possible that I could transfer this work into a large tome that could very well be something like what people of all ages have sort of demanded and held against God in some sense. That, well, why isn't there a manual? Why isn't there a manual for sort of for human consciousness and human life? Like where is the sort of the how to book? And can't even remember all the. I mean, over the 27 years that I've been working on this model, um, or at least in the last sort of 8 years, I've been thinking about all the different names that I could try to write a book. Sort of crazy names. After the after Eden, after the fall, uh, the science of sin. Uh, hmm, those are some catchy names. Uh, I can't even remember. Well, I mean, they're all in my notes somewhere probably. But oh yeah, some very crazy names. Or the something about a lord. The account of a lord. Huh. I can't. These things don't work without the subtitles. I can't remember. Um, in fact, I think those were actually linked together. The Science of Sin subtitle after Eden. Anyway, it's not. It's very interesting that in this book that I read, The Triadic Heart of Siva, there was mention of what I believe to be the sword outside of Eden, or the cherubim that guards the way to the tree of life, the sword that turns every way. And oh, this is embarrassing. I'll probably forget the name, but in the book, I think that this figure is called Ruka, or it was like a 4 or 5 letter, and it's RU, and then it had a kind of consonant. I think it was Ruka or Rurka or something like that. And it talks about, was that the figure that delivers from the sea? No, I'm probably mixing that up. But a crow and a cow. Was it a crow? Was it a raven? Oh, I think it was a crow. Anyway, that's a very strange sort of. See, oh, anyway, I probably haven't decoded that, but I mean, generally, the cattle is very symbolic. It's even one of the primary categories um, in Genesis, that the cattle um, is made in the image of his kind and their kind. Um, that there's a kind of a distinct pool of karmic bondage or karmic. This is a metaphor within a metaphor, which is a bit. But essentially, the creatures which are described around the throne of God, which I believe have sort of like 4 faces or something like that as well. There's 4 creatures with 4 faces each. Um, that the field circuits themselves are a distinct, in some sense, I think that they exist in my model in the seventh dimension of psychological reality, which is essentially the blood, the channel of manifestation and the reservoir of consciousness that, essentially everything that happens to you, your hormones, what you've eaten, what you haven't eaten, if you've slept badly or something like that, it's going to have a residue in the blood, which is essentially there for your consciousness to subsist in conjunction there too. And so there's an immediate awareness of the or when an immediate this is a weird, I don't mean this as a oxymoron, but there's an immediate sense of how things are lingering within a particular pool, that how long can you immediately sense something as a kind of as a resonant tone of what you should be perhaps focused on internally. So you have this internal witness, you have the blood to sort of as a sensory thread undergirding consciousness, which is in some sense linking us to the karmic field circuits, and I mean generally you could amalgamate it into, well, there are four animals around the throne. The number four essentially I think is only significant because in my model I actually have a model of four distinct karmic circuits, but one can translate itself into another, which is hopefully I'm not misspeaking in saying that the four beasts or the four creatures, I think they're called creatures, have four. I mean, I've actually read quite a bit of Revelations recently, and I don't remember reading them having four faces. So I'm maybe that might be an extrapolation. But they all speak in unison, at least around the throne. But anyway, and in some sense, I think that is the crux of the developmental problem in terms of the unconscious side of the mind, which I would, at least then roughly, because I keep on saying that I have to make a new model, but Keegan's stage 3, the core of Keegan's stage 3 in the embodied sense would be the vanity, would be the dominant function in MBTI language, the dominant function of the unconscious side of the mind. And then on the other side of that is the parent function, which is basically the that's too complicated to introduce all that sort of stuff now. But anyway, the point is that the dominant function is in some sense, I think, the inculcation of essentially your immersion into those field circuits and the embodied imprintation and but the parent function is floating above that to some degree, and it is prone to its own distinct form of toxicity. So in some sense, I think that it is very useful to track that there are two forms of unconscious work that are very important. The one being the kind of embodied unconsciousness, and the other one being a kind of transpersonal projection of belief structures and sort of narrative. And often these things are cojoined, and in some sense, unless you can kind of disambiguate them and see the category, the put it in two distinct columns, you'll never be able to sort of see where the transpersonal ideological accountability is being entrenched by an embodied unconscious habituation and inculturation. And unless you have the ability to think in choice of self-determinism and of choice of alternative, and in some sense the parent function, but more importantly, the inferior function, which has to get the parent on its side, or the parent has to essentially not make the dominant function comfortable, but instead has to allow itself to somewhat be a sword, a double-edged sword that cuts. If it's going to cut the inferior function, as it habitually does, it's going to cut similar havoc against the dominant function in exchange for what is done against the inferior function. And that trade-off between the parent function and the dominant function is how the inferior function uncovers the dead bodies trapped in the sea. Um, and this is not achieved by anyway action in inaction and inaction within action. Uh, that this only makes sense to someone who, I mean, in the Gita, the Gita has a lot of brilliant simplistic things. The problem is that it doesn't really have the details, as far as I can see. It's not really. In fact, it quite explicitly does not have a road to salvation. I mean, the closest thing that it gets to is it says meditate on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. By meditating on the Supreme Personality, that you will grow in understanding of it. So I don't know. That, I mean, is roughly correct, but it's not good enough. And some of the other and I mean, do you, and I guess you should add as well, to do your duty, and in some sense, in the sense of duty and in the sense of meditation on the Supreme Personality, you can work out an ethical. In some sense, Balarama is much better at describing the process of salvation, and in some sense is very much, quite obviously, a proto-Christ teacher. Sorry, there was another point that I've just skipped over. What should I say? What should I say? So I was talking about the Gita. Oh yeah. The other thing that's useful in the Gita is that it talks about the introspective sage who is awake at night and at sleep during the day. And the introspective sage is and who is awake at night and asleep during the day. This is a way, in some sense, I believe, to signify at least some veil of privacy and solitude. And in some sense, privacy does not mean necessarily to be completely alone, but to sort of to choose one's sanctum of concerted, deliberate investigation and introspection. And until one regards oneself seriously as an introspective sage, in some sense, there is I think they are decidedly not a neophyte, or even decidedly incapable of becoming a candidate neophyte. In some sense, they were never on the path, as Mark Passio would put it. And what I was talking about with the ENTPs and stuff, and I mean, that can sound a little bit harsh. I mean, in some sense, the real problem with ENTPs is just the state of culture is so bad, and then they are very good at projecting. ENTPs are very good at being impregnated with a sort of narrative and then trying to refine it and then projecting it further. So they can often sort of exacerbate toxicity. It just so happens that their inferior functions in their unconscious and their ego are I'm going to speak out of turn, I think. Damn, I just made a recording recently talking about it. I think their problem is that it's their parent functions in their ego and their unconscious are both. Oh, that's embarrassing. Damn, I could look up it. I could actually work it out by looking at this, but it's going to be embarrassing. I'm a metatype 13. My model of an ENTP is metatype 17. That's five dimensions removed. So that means that, yeah, their ego's dominant function. No. Their ego's their unconscious's parent function is extroverted feeling, and then therefore their ego, so parent, inferior, sin. No, parent, yeah, parent, inferior, sin, inferior, sin, child, dominant, parent. Okay, yeah, so their unconscious parent function is extroverted feeling, and their ego's parent function is introverted feeling. And their inferior function in their ego's extroverted feeling, and their inferior function in their ego is introverted feeling. So yeah, they've got an unconscious inferior function of introverted feeling. So their parent function is extroverted feeling in their unconscious, and their inferior function is introverted feeling. So that already is, and those dimensions are dimension 1 and dimension 2. They are the primary dimensions. So their problem, their unconscious toxicity is like the most toxic that is possible. Or maybe, actually, you might argue that metatype 16s could be more toxic, but I would argue that they're so toxic in that fundamental issue that they contain themselves very well. But also it's very overt to other people. Their toxicity is very striking to other people. Because they're going from dimension 17 parent function to dimension 1 inferior function. Anyway, that's metatype 16. That's not an ENTP. ENTPs, their parent function in their unconscious is dimension 1, and their inferior function is dimension 2, which again is extroverted feeling parent, introverted feeling inferior. That's a huge problem. It really is. And then their parent function, let me do this again. So inferior sin, child, dominant. Yeah, so the parent function is introverted feeling in their ego, and their inferior function in their ego is extroverted feeling, which is ironic because it's literally and this is a different form of introverted feeling and a different form of extroverted feeling, because it's in my model there's more than one of each of the 8 cognitive functions, except for extroverted thinking. Extroverted thinking is only comes from one dimension. There, it doesn't have a duplicate of the 8 cognitive functions. This is the complexity of having 17 cognitive functions. I use the descriptive layer of Jungian cognitive functions because it makes it much more relatable. It makes it much more digestible. And I even use them to think about it because I have derived my own definitions of the 8 cognitive functions, which are which, let's say, generically take this stuff into account. So I would even argue that my definitions of cognitive function are far superior, or at least metaphysically and philosophically far superior to those in the field. I'll just rattle them off quickly. SI, and I guess a lot of people will argue, well, this is so abstract and so technical. But anyway, I think that these are actually much more workable definitions, although perhaps involving some kind of jargonistic sort of mesoteric sort of weighting of these words. Okay, so extroverted sensing I define as referencing a perspective in relation to experience. And extroverted sensing is experiencing the present context and appraising its potential. Introverted intuition, grasping a substantiation through impression. Extroverted intuition, extrapolating the potential of perception. That is a bit vague, but in some sense that is the nature of extroverted intuition. It's potentially a kind of Pandora's box. Extroverted, let me keep the same pattern, start with introverted feeling, applying one's own measure of worthiness or value. Extroverted feeling, determination of expression, in brackets any presentation, by realizing the potential of situation, in brackets any substance. Let me just read that twice, one with the brackets and one without the brackets. Determination of expression by realizing the potential of situation. The reason why I put these qualifications in brackets is because there are forms of extroverted feeling which are very ephemeral and much more sophisticated, and that's why the brackets become necessary. Determination of expression, in brackets any presentation, by realizing the potential of situation, any substance. So situation as in any substance and expression as in any presentation. You can see how that becomes scalable into a kind of exterior projection or instinct. Or fathering, or the blood doesn't really have a good motif that I can just rattle off. But anyway, introverted thinking, determining and applying a substantiation to a correlation. It's literally just self-consistency. That's all it is. Sorry, self-consistency isn't determining and applying a substantiation to a correlation. It's a labeling. That's all TI is. It's a matrix of labeling, or perhaps if you want to compile it as an entire matrix, or it can just be a single substantiation applied to a correlation. And in some sense, I do have it, I think, accurately written here. Determining and applying a substantiation to a correlation, it is completely locked in the present. TI cannot occur in a snapshot. You cannot freeze a frame of TI. It's no longer TI at that point. So when TI is atrophied or toxic or intoxified or whatever, it's essentially it becomes essentially usually channeled through something else in some sense. TE, constructing and directing one's observation of apparent truth. Truth here is perhaps is never a nice, is perhaps it's problematic to use a word like that. It's perhaps charged for some people philosophically, but constructing and directing one's observation of apparent truth. Constructing and directing one's observation. So TE is always your own, or it belongs to yourself. And in some sense, it doesn't have to be true for you to have a TE construction and direction of one's observation upon it. But I would say that you do have to treat it as an apparent truth, because otherwise within the TE model, it's not going to be coherent, and it's not going to be constructed or directed. In some sense, it's going to be deconstructed and undirected. So TE is in a lot of ways quite special. But anyway, I'm just going to juxtapose one thing, because if people listen to my recordings, they will hear this so often. But basically, extroverted feeling and introverted thinking within MBTI circles is very badly understood. They are often seen as sort of as a weird kind of dichotomy, because they're both judging functions, they're both internal judging functions. So in MBTI circles, TI is generally thought of as being judging what is right and what is wrong in a kind of in a correct or incorrect kind of judgment, and then in a kind of technical correctness, or a kind of objective truthfulness. That there's usually this idea, well, we can all agree if something is correct or incorrect, as if it's kind of like a factual correlate or something like that. And then the idea is that introverted feeling, though, on the other hand, is subjective. And that is essentially a kind of ethical judgment of right and wrong, although in MBTI they often mix up FE and FI in my accounting of these things, that FI is not morality, FI is ethics, and FE is morality. But anyway, that's a semantic perhaps irrelevancy. But so FI is seen as the judgment of what is good and bad, and TI is the judgment of what is correct or incorrect, or what is right and wrong. So right and wrong and good and bad is sort of now, in some sense, I would rather have that flipped on its head completely. That weird sort of narrative, I think it is an inversion. In some sense, TI is much. In some sense, you could say TI is telling you if something is good or bad, because it's telling you if it's rational or irrational in some sense. But I mean, this is where I think, in some sense, good or bad, the knowledge of good and bad is a TI thing, which is why it's ephemeral, it's illusory, it's self-delusory. You are deluding yourself into thinking that you can know what is good or bad, what is good and evil in the TI sense. Goodness as a deep reality is in some sense only within FI, and that's because FI, introverted feeling, when you judge something to be right or wrong ethically, that although it might not be exact enough, you could say, well, it has the seed of something that could grow into a tree, that symbolically FI can be complete, whereas TI can never be holistically complete and can never be individually complete in some sense without an independent substantiation of it, which is in some sense, I think, grounded in FI. This is why FI is also in the position of being the second dimension of psychological reality. And that second dimension is, in some sense, the true ground of the whole model is in the second dimension, not in the first dimension, but in the second dimension. Because the first dimension by itself is just the base material. And the immediate thing that subsists within it, that is encapsulated in the chaos, is the spirit of a life that is having to relate within the base material and contend itself within the incarnation of the base material. And so, I mean, the second dimension, FI, is basically the spirit. And TI, there are many forms of TI. In fact, there are 3 forms of TI within my model of cognitive functions. And anyway, and TI is the next. So TI is the synthesis of FE and FI, well, at least the third dimension of psychological reality is an introverted thinking that is the synthesis of the first 2. In some sense, every dimension of psychological reality is the amalgamation of all the dimensions below it, operating as a kind of as a collateral correlated sphere of operation. And then each next dimension is then again a kind of meta synthesis of itself relating to itself on a higher level of flow and integration. And these are all spheres of prepositional anyway, I don't want to get too bogged down by this. Oh, damn, I should have said this in my last recording. It's kind of embarrassing to say, it's sort of excusing myself, but you know, a lot of people, especially in when I'm trying to have a rag on psychology, obviously when you're in a field and you know that you don't understand anything, it's very important to be very precise with your language, because then at least then what you're doing in some kind of neo-pragmatist academic sense, you can always hope is going to be the ingredients to some later discovery that you're doing real work and such. And I mean, there's something to that, but I just want to say that essentially when that becomes taken by people as some kind of authority or some kind of, and what it essentially is false authority, but where essentially it all the qualification of that we don't actually know what the fuck we're talking about sort of gets thrown out the window and forgotten and lost. In this weird kind of stabilizing cult, which sort of also embeds itself within culture and society, because essentially all due humility is sort of papered over by, let's say, the incentives of needing to be part of a profession that has a kind of an important lineage and an important piece of the cultural pie, perhaps, or something like that. Um, anyway, I'll just say that obviously it's embarrassing that when I don't have such beautiful technical jargon to sort of spill, uh, and that's effectively because I don't need it, because I know what I'm talking about, because I actually have a fucking model. And you have to talk very delicately when you don't have a model, um, because you're basically parroting things that are somewhat rote. And in some sense, it's a kind of, well, I don't want to say that it's perhaps not a model, it certainly is a model. Um, but it's a model that portends sort of no, well, I mean, no, it's not true. Some people, no, no, it's hard to, I mean, what I'm just basically trying to say is that you can tell when people are talking about things that they have no understanding thereof. It's just a descriptive narrative, and they're just prattling it off. Uh, they're just regurgitating, and there are very few people that actually have understandings of models. And then and in some sense, they know the dubiousness of or the tentative nature of the model itself, or at least can have their own ideas about its lack of explanatory power, or at least some sensibility as to its potential flaws and weaknesses can be levied against it. Obviously, dissemination is something that I should probably learn to be better at, but and that does require using clear and precise language. But I mean, I used to have come up with these very interesting diatribes about my own language pattern, which I do think is quite noble and useful in many ways as well, because in some sense, I mean, I'm pitching myself at the level at which that I need the listener to be engaged and to digest uh, and develop their own model in some sense, or to try to. In some sense, I can't really say that I expect people to duplicate some of the things that I'm talking about, because they are too too fragmented, and not being presented in a pedagogical sequence. And I'm usually talking about topics that would require much too much patience. But in some sense, these recordings were meant to be sort of raw, just recordings of my research notes, in case something were to happen to me, so that there would be some uh, record of my work. But I must say that is something that I don't think I'm that worried about it now, but it used to frighten me, the idea that if I were to croak suddenly, or to be taken out, or to die, that all of my arduous effort and 27 years of enslavement to this project would have all gone down the drain. The metagram, a theory of personality pathology, providing descriptions of how the ego can be entangled by circular emotional arguments for the execution of one's ego-locked premise and the discharge of one's sinful judgments. Oh, that actually basically holds, and I wrote that in 2013. Weird. And the only thing I changed in these notes that was wrong is that I changed the label of sattva to rajas, and obviously the other one around, and then I ended up relabeling myself as sattva. Because I always used to consider myself to be I think I'm the first angry eight. I'm the first angry eight. And I always used to consider myself a Rajasic angry eight. Or first, or the reason why I say first is because there's a second, and the number doesn't mean anything. It's just an arbitrary naming convention because it was hard to come up with names for 48 metagram types. And to some extent, it's still weird to answer the question, where does metagram fit into metatype? Because in some sense it only can be projected onto the 17 model, and the metatype is within the 17 model. So it's sort of, there are three layers of reality then. There is the basic 17 model, there is the metatype 17 pathological structure, which is in some sense covering 18 actually, what is 6 times 4? No, you don't go 6 times 4, you go, no, it is 18 essentially. That doesn't make sense to call it 18. You might as well just call it 17 then, or you might as well call it 24. Oh, there's a number. Oh, I didn't think about that. 6 times 4 is 24. 24 minus 17 . Seven. That's interesting. Wait, that doesn't sound right. No, it is right. So there's an extra 7 there. Let's see, if you just counted all the overlaps. So now I'm just nakedly speculating. If you just counted all the overlaps, it would be from, I'm a metatype 13, so all the overlaps in the type would be No, you can't say that. You can't say 17 minus 24. I think you would have to say 18. Now, there's a weird ambiguity there because the ego sin, which is also the... Oh, maybe I should count them out. No, that's the odd one out. That's why it's 7, and yeah, that's why, because that's the 7th, is the ego sin, which is the superego's death. That's the one that doesn't sort of conform to the other ones. So wait, so if I've got a model of 17 and 7, 17 and 7, all the overlaps. Okay, so my overlap would be dimension 3 is the superego. Superego death, which is also the sins. The ego sin. So that could also be counted as 2. And then all the others are 2, 2, 2, and they could also be doubled up. How are they dispersed? So you go 3, and then the next overlap is 7, 8. And then the next overlap is 11, 12. Seven, 8, 11, 12. Wait, I was wrong. That's only 5. There aren't 7. Wait, why did I say 7? Because there are 24 elements if you look at each side of the mind and you double count them. But there are only 17 dimensions. So when you're dividing the number of dimensions by, you should get all the overlaps. So then there needs to be 7 overlaps. 1, 2, 3. There are no overlaps in the ego, between the ego and the superego. So those must be the 2 dimensions that are symbolic of, in Scientology, what's called free theta, or the tone arm. That the tone arm would be those 2 ego functions, which would otherwise be abrogated in other, which basically means that the inferior function is the source of free theta in the ego, and the parent function. But essentially that internal dichotomy is probably reflective of the other 5, the state of the other 5. So that being firstly the overlap of the subconscious and the superego. Firstly, the overlap between the superego and the subconscious, which in my type is 7, 8, and then the overlap between the unconscious and the subconscious, which is 11, 12. So 7, 8, 11, 12, and then that will be reflected in the free theta relationship, or let's say, or the lack thereof, or the state of, rather call it the state of free theta, is symbolized by the inferior function and the sin. Or I said it was symbolized by the parent function and the inferior before, but it's so much more symmetrical just to call it that. Oh no, I'm not looking at the right thing. I'm looking at stupid things. Let me say that again. So the parent function, my parent function in the ego is Fe, and my dominant function, no, my inferior function in the ego is Fi, and then the sin is Ti. So in some sense, I think the sin is double. Is that the 6 is the 7, or it's 6 things, but the sin counts twice as 2 separate things, I would say. Because, so the inferior function has to relate to the sin twice, because it is both the sin of the ego, but it's also the death of the subconscious, or the limit of the subconscious, to put it. It is the mass weighing on the. I said subconscious. I meant to say superego. Damn it. So yeah, the sin of the ego is the death of the superego. It's the mass of the superego. And so to disentangle that mass, yeah, I should look at that more in depth. I think that you can't just disentangle it though. You have to, because it's 2 separate bundles of entanglement. It is that the inferior function of the ego has to take responsibility for the sin of the ego, but it also has to relate itself it has to translate itself into the superego, which can only be done by a kind of codependency of death, of sacrifice, that essentially that the inferior function dies along with the sin of the ego, so that it can sort of own the death of the superego, but that ownership is not so that it can be toyed with or can be animated, but it's so that it can be sat with in the grave. And then the child function of the superego is also sat with in the grave. And those are the 3 days in the grave, is the day of the crucifixion. No, the day of the crucifixion and the night before of the Last Supper. So it's the night and then the day. That's the first day in the grave already. Is that the inferior function? Now, I think in that model it actually makes a lot more sense. Because then when the inferior function is in that mode, it's very useful. It's a very useful self-realization that I at least just had about that. And then that already attunes the inferior function to being within the introverted thinking. Sorry, not in, but with the sin of the ego. Because you see, the sin is not the sin of the self. It is an emergent property that is, and this is why I always say that the ego should be understood as a static, as a solid state, because the sin, which is in some sense it's not really a reflection of the ego itself. If anything, it's a reflection of the non-execution of the child function, which is itself a repurposing of the sin of the unconscious. So the child function is already just trying to redeem the unconscious, which can only ever be properly redeemed if the child function in the unconscious is untethered from the toxic influence and its toxic origin story of the subconscious. So essentially, the problem of self-actualization is the innate toxicity of the subconscious, which can only be transcended by partitioning away from it, but by segregating the subconscious from the unconscious and having the unconscious be reborn in a kind of in an independent new unit of time of a present orientation, which is in some sense when time itself is untethered from an objective narrative of an external locus of control. When one has the confidence in one's beingness, in one's own faculty of self-evaluation and self-determinism and such. Anyway, now that seems like it's up in the air. Well, because essentially when you start to develop the partition between the subconscious and the unconscious, it's feigned, it's mocked, it's a mockery, it's a simulation, it's a trial, it's a trial run through, it's an attempt. It's not known yet for sure. It's not confirmed, as it were, and it gets confirmed by essentially only through the rehabilitation of the superego, which will effectively clear up the toxicity of the subconscious. But that can't ever happen. You see, this is the bootstrapping problem. This is why you have to be reborn in the unconscious. And in some sense, I think that you can be reborn by fire in the ego. That inducts a similar partition between the subconscious and the unconscious. That as the baptism by fire is occurring, that partition, knowledge of that partition can perhaps be ostensibly duplicated in the self-identification of the subconscious with fire, with what the fire is illuminating about the transgressive nature of the subconscious. And so there is the sense in which the fire consumes, the fire uh, I can't think of the word that means that it uses up the fuel that it's it burns the charge in the subconscious by not invalidating it, but by exhausting its supply of reactive life in some sense, while making room. Anyway, or making room for the, let's say, the independent. This doesn't work with the metaphor that well, but with the independence of a clear body of water, that can be the space with which, well, eventually the most important thing is that the clear water of the child function is a reflection of the face. And I realized the similarity between this and narcissus. And this is why I speak so often about benign narcissism, that the dominant function in the unconscious side of the mind can see its reflection in the child function, in its former child function, because it no longer has a child function. Because there is actually a partition between the unconsciousness of the child function, which is no longer part of the unconsciousness, which essentially becomes a clear body of water that is the resolution, the settlement of the subconscious, of the enlightened subconscious. Now, in some way, this I think that if you plaster people with this, it doesn't, unless you give them the actual baptism by fire, it's not useful. This is what I don't like about if I am to be blunt, this is what I don't like about Hare Krishna proselytization, is that you have the peace pipe on full display with the pretty words. And I understand the idea as well, you're trying to advertise to people a harmony, a peaceful model of receiving nectar. And then, if you actually do become an initiate or you do join, then, the rigor and the mechanics it's yeah, I mean, I guess it could just be a way of I guess what I don't like is that it's if you just sort of anyway, I mean, this is quite a sort of complicated thing, but if you positively charge people's unconscious child function with some kind of positive remittance, then it becomes very difficult when you're actually doing real potential spiritual work, because then they've got these heuristics and reliances and remittances that allow them to entrench within their because they can use those remittances to validate and to quite frankly privilege their child function. And this, in some sense, this is not even where the problem is. The problem is that there'll be a mirror pathological equilibrium between the parent and the parent and the dominant function, but also this will cast a shadow on the inferior function, uh, and that shadow will also have its own corresponding sort of codependent pathological uh, dynamic between the parent and the dominant. But actually, in talking through this, I'm very glad that I went through this little journey, I guess, because now I'm seeing the importance of the child function and the child function being still in the unconscious, and the essentially no longer being the child function, but just being the resolution of the subconscious, and in some sense this is in Revelations, I believe, what is spoken about when it talks about a new heaven and a new earth, um, and the new Jerusalem, and uh, let me just see how I model this so that the parent function in the superego uh, is the is the uh, is the new heaven, and the dominant function in the superego is the new Jerusalem. So it goes, dominant function is the new Jerusalem, which is the first thing that is revived after the resurrection. So the child function is part of the 3 days in the grave. He says the inferior function goes into the grave. Of the inferior function of the ego goes into the grave, which is the Last Supper, and the day of the crucifixion is the first day in the grave. Second day in the grave is the sin of the ego, which is also the death of the superego, and then the third day in the grave is the child function in the superego. Those are the 3 days in the grave, and then the dominant function in the superego becomes the new Jerusalem. The inferior function becomes the new heaven. The sin becomes the new earth, and then the next two dimensions become the water, the sea that gives up its dead, uh, that gets unkeyed. So those two dimensions, 8 and 9, anyway, I think those are sort of the seas. And then 10, what is 10? Oh, I think I've got the number. 6 is the new Jerusalem. No, 5 is the new Jerusalem. 6 is the new heaven. 7 is the new earth. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That is, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 is the rest. Wait, but I said 7 is the new heaven, 8 is the new earth. So 9, 10, 11, 12. 9, 10, 11, 12. Yeah, so 9, 10, 11, 12 is the rest of the subconscious. Is that all the sea? 9, 10, 11, 12 is all the sea. And then that culminates in 12. So 12 is the culmination of the sea that gives up its dead, but it has to sort of fall in line from after 8, and 8 is obviously the new earth. I wonder, you could invert it, you could say 11, 12, that is the new earth and the new heaven, and 12 is the new heaven. Yeah, I guess I'll have to meditate on that. Still speculating, but essentially I think that 12 being a reflection, either way, I mean, heaven can also be a reflection, or it can be the sea that has given up its dead. So it's no longer, it's given up the salt, the residue of the life. Becomes a clear water. And in that clear water, the dominant function in the unconscious can know itself without disturbance, because it can see its reflection in the surface of the clear water. Perhaps reminiscent of the Genesis quote, the face of God upon the water. That's not the reflection of the self is not the face of God, but the Spirit of God is above the water. It's not in the water, it's not on the surface, it's sort of it's gleaned, it's not read, it's understood within the self. And so that will mean that the dominant function in the unconscious becomes like the seventh church spoken of at the beginning of Revelations. And this is embarrassing, I might be wrong when I say this, but I believe it is the fifth church that is the church that talks about the white stone. So I think that, oh no, wait, the seventh church is the, did I say that right? The seventh church is the dominant function. Therefore, Sardis, the fifth, would be the 11th dimension. So the white stone from the 11th dimension, I should read those last three churches again, might give me some new insight on the integration of the poetry that I went into about the spirit on the surface of the waters, but essentially that then the fifth church and the sixth church become like those waters, and then the seventh church is capable of sort of getting itself together. What about the other things? And then the parent function can be rehabilitated, and then the inferior function in the unconscious can also be properly integrated and serviced as a proper sort of unit, and that's sort of perhaps all within the ambit of the Seventh Church, under the kind of bottom-driven cohesion of the Seventh Church. Because usually it is the the Seventh Church becomes, I believe, the true grounding of the ascended self-actualization. So essentially, I think that the Keegan stage 3 is, which I link to the unconscious side of the mind, is in some sense the ground zero of the rebirth and the ascended man, the enlightened being is grounded in a reborn sorry, I should rather say not reborn, resurrected, in a resurrected unconscious. That the rebirth was just a step towards the resurrection. I mean, I'll just say this explicitly, but I mean, if you think that Christianity is about a vicarious redemption, then you don't have proper doctrine. There's explicit exclusion of vicarious redemption in the doctrine of Christ. Anyway, that's an interesting set of topics.